everybody. Welcome to Bookends Online Edition, um, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Story Seller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Bookends programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, July 9th, 2022, and will feature Julie Jo Larson, who will talk about her book, 100 Things to Do in the Minnesota Northwood Before You Die. This month's speaker is Gary Goodman, who will talk about his book, The Last Bookseller, A Life in the Rare Book Trade. When Gary Goodman wandered into a rundown used bookshop that was going out of business in East St. Paul in 1982, he had no idea the visit would change his life. He walked in as a psychiatric counselor and walked out as the store's new owner. In this book, Goodman describes his sometimes desperate, sometimes hilarious career as a used and rare book dealer in Minnesota. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. Now let's welcome to Bookends Online Edition, Gary Goldman. Welcome.
It's Goodman, Gary Goodman.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Thank you, Shelley, for that introduction, and thanks to the Wadena Historical Society for having me, and also to the Five Wings Arts Council that apparently provided a grant for these talks, which I think are just great. Now, I want to clear up a misconception right at the outset, and that is that although I may look old enough to be the last bookseller, I am not, in fact, the last bookseller. There are plenty of booksellers still around, but as I say in the first paragraph of my book, I might be one of the last of a certain kind of bookseller. The kind that for 600 years rooted around basements, book bins, and bookstores looking for sometimes rare books, or more often second-hand books. They were the hunter-gatherers of the book business, the travelers and pickers who spent their lives saving books that might otherwise have been lost. They are now nearly extinct, driven to ground by the machines, the cell phones, personal computers, and especially the internet that replaced them at the end of the 20th century. I am one of that species of bookseller who specializes in reselling books that have been published, distinct from booksellers who sell new books. And so at the lower level, those are used books or secondhand books. And at the higher level, they're rare or antiquarian books. I sold plenty of both, so I don't make much of a distinction between the books themselves. Some books just cost more than others, basically. The book itself is about my nearly 40-year career as a used and rare book dealer in Minnesota, and is in some ways a conventional story. How I got started as a bookseller in 1982, the remarkable, larger-than-life and sometimes criminal people I met buying and selling books, and some of the unusual books I found and the weird places I found them. But the story is also about the dramatic changes that took place in the used and rare book market during the last 20 years or so because of the internet. Just as an aside, I would have pictures to show, but every time I've tried to do that, I've messed it up terribly, and so you're just going to have to listen to me. You're just going to have to listen to me talk and use your imaginations. Before the internet came along, the used and rare book business hadn't changed much since Roman times. When I said 600 years in that first paragraph, I mean printed books, which began, of course, when Gutenberg printed his Bible in 1440. But there are accounts of people selling secondhand handwritten manuscripts outside the gates of Rome 2,000 years ago. In the United States, used book selling has been a significant part of the American fabric since its founding. Benjamin Franklin sold used books, as did Henry Knox, George Washington's Secretary of War. Fort Knox, where they keep all the gold, is named after him. And in an earlier draft of the book, I joked that this is somewhat ironic, since the closest that most poor booksellers get to anything gold is the crowns on their teeth. But this, unfortunately, this great witticism did not make it into the final draft. It has even been suggested that the humble used bookseller, by rescuing and preserving so many books and manuscripts over the years, has contributed more to Western civilization than most museums or libraries. So the changes that have occurred in the used and rare book business are not on the same level as, say, what happened to Blockbuster Video or travel agencies or phone books. This is an ancient business that has been around since shortly after people started putting words on paper. In more modern terms, as I say in the book, when the internet came along, it was for secondhand booksellers like a lawyer waking up and discovering that all his clients had gotten law degrees. Before 2000, it took years of experience to become a successful secondhand bookseller. After 2000, anyone in their pajamas with a box of books, a cup of coffee, and a cable connection could buy and sell books online. Between 1990 and 2000, there were nearly 400 used and rare bookshops in New York City. Now there are fewer than 70. There were almost 50 in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Now there are fewer than 10. The internet wiped out many secondhand booksellers and their traditional bookshops almost overnight. It has been estimated that nearly 70% of all the secondhand booksellers around before 2000 have either gone online or have gone out of business. Paradoxically, there are probably more booksellers around now than ever before, simply because the internet has made buying and selling used and rare books so much easier to do. Whether most of these people selling online are actually making a living at it is another story. Since the book is subtitled A Life in the Rare Book Trade, let's talk a little bit about how I got into the secondhand book business in the first place. It was 1982 and I was working the night shift as a psychiatric counselor on a unit that treated violent and mentally ill adolescents. I talk about a particularly scary incident in the book, but suffice it to say that I came to the realization that working with people who want to kill you is not a viable long-term profession. So I definitely was looking for something else to do. One day my wife came home and told me that a small used bookstore a few blocks away from us in East St. Paul was going out of business, and I should go check it out. So when I went to the store, it was, as I say in the book, no bigger than a rich person's walk-in closet. There were books everywhere, paperbacks, book club books, Reader's Digest condensed books, and a number of older books that were published kind of around the turn of the century. And I thought, boy, this guy really doesn't know what he's doing. He's got very valuable books here because these books were so old. So I so I struck up a conversation with him, and the owner, and whose name was Frank, and he claimed he was closing the store because he had a heart condition. He said he wanted to sell the business, but so far had no takers. In the book, I describe what happened next. So the thought of buying a going concern filled with valuable books, I liked books, didn't I? From a man who, but for a heart condition, would not be selling this plum in the middle of East St. Paul made perfect sense. If you sold the business instead of closing it, how much would it be? I asked Frank, just out of curiosity. Frank's eyes lit up at this prospect. Let's see, he said, climbing up on the chair behind the counter and grabbing a pencil. You have your books, 4,000 good books, hand-picked. Then your fixtures, the bookcases, display racks, etc. Then there's the goodwill, the name, the location. To this day, I can't imagine what kind of goodwill this guy had generated. But anyway, I'd probably sell the whole works for $25,000. $25,000. I could barely pay my rent, much less $25,000. I already worked double shifts on the psychiatric unit 2 or 3 times a week. The car I drove, a 1969 Volvo I'd bought for $200, didn't have working windshield wipers. On cold nights, I had to bring the battery into the house so the car would start in the morning. Frank saw the shock the figure generated. Of course, he continued, I have the heart condition, plus I'd have to move all the books that don't sell, so I'd probably take $10,000. I turned away. I didn't have $10,000 either. But Frank continued to negotiate with himself. Then there's the lease on the store, he said, which runs another 3 months. I'll be on the hook for that. So I'm thinking I'd hate to do it, but I'd take $2,000 for the whole thing. He paused. No reaction from me. On a contract for deed at $100 a month. I perked up. And nothing down, he said. And that's how I became the owner of a used bookstore in East St. Paul. Even at this bargain basement price, this turned out to be a horrible decision. I found out later that Frank's 4,000 hand-picked books were the leftovers he picked up from every estate sale, library sale, and garage sale around the Twin Cities. Books he rescued on their way to the dumpster. I had another book dealer come over and look at the books, and he said he came over. This was Larry Dingman from Minneapolis. Let me get a drink here, just a quick. This was Larry Dingman from Minneapolis, and he came over to the store and he looked around for about 10 minutes and he turned to me and he said, "This is the worst, most picked over stock of books I've ever seen in my life." So this was a pretty inauspicious beginning to my career as a bookseller. Still, like many before me, I became fascinated by the book business. And during my first years on Arcade Street, that was in East St. Paul, I muddled through, working the night shift and running the store during the day. One thing I did was start going to estate sales and library sales. And it was there, as I say in the book, that I met the denizens of the book-buying underworld. From the book again. Some of the most educated and honorable people I have ever met were in the book business. But some of the most unsavory and illiterate were in the book business too. Those who operated at my low level, and some I met as I moved up the ranks, could be strange and troubled individuals. Loners, survivalists, and petty criminals regularly bought and sold used books on the open market. I was new, unfamiliar with their rituals and hierarchy, a curiosity to the other book people. "Are you the idiot who bought Frank's store in East St. Paul?" they'd ask. It took me 4 years to learn the business, and 8 years to actually start making something of a living selling secondhand books, so that I could quit the hospital job. I might be a slow learner, but I eventually had 6 kids, and so I had to figure out how to make a living for them too. It might be interesting to just talk a little bit about why it took me or anyone who got into the secondhand book business before the internet so long to learn the business. And simply put, this is because the secondhand book universe is enormous. If you figure that every book that goes out of print is technically a secondhand book eventually, the used book universe is about 300 times larger than the new book universe. And I was talking to Gillette before this started, and she said that there were 20,000 books published every month. There's probably more than that, actually. Quoting from the book again, Google Books recently calculated that there have been nearly 130 million individual titles published since the invention of the printing press. Over 700,000 new titles come out every year. And like I say, I think it's probably 1.5 million if you consider self-publishing and all that kind of thing now. According to Louis Busby's The Yellow Lighted Bookshop, if you read one book, I thought this was a shocking fact. If you read one book a week starting at age 5, and live to be 80, so Tony is just about there, you will have read a grand total of 3,900 books, a little over 1/10% of the books currently in print. Current bestsellers have print runs of 2 million or more, but assume over time that the average print run is 2,500 copies. That's 335 billion physical books that have been published or printed to date, only the smallest fraction of which have any demand on the resale market, on the used and rare book market. Before the internet, secondhand booksellers sorted without a computer at their fingertips through this immense pile and picked out the books that they could sell. The computing and organizing power of the internet introduced order, competition, and efficiency into the secondhand book business. In some ways, this has been good news for consumers and collectors, but bad news for booksellers, who relied on a certain amount of chaos, lack of a competition, and inefficiency in order to make a living. As I say in the book, because of the internet, the availability of secondhand books soared and prices plummeted. This was especially hard on mid-range book dealers who owned most of the secondhand bookshops. The demand for a good portion of the books that they relied on to make a living dropped like day-old donuts. Before booksellers had to know the price and market for books, once this information was everywhere, booksellers had no competitive advantage over anyone else. A good example is the A.B. Bookman's Weekly. Before the internet, if you wanted a book on, say, you wanted a first edition Hemingway or a book on the properties of cement or anything that was out of print, you had to go to a secondhand book dealer to get it. That was the only way. So, so you would have to you'd go to the store and you'd tell them what you were looking for, and they would write it down, and then they would send it to the A.B. Bookman's Weekly and advertise for it. And then, so that could take, a month or 2 months. And then they would, and then if somebody else had it, they would let them know. I mean, the whole process could take 6 months or a year, and there was no guarantee that you'd find the book anyway. So it was a very primitive process compared to now, where you can go online and find just about any book in 30 seconds. And so you can see why this would have such an impact on the secondhand bookseller. Just that factor alone, that so many people made their living searching and finding books for people, and that no longer was the case when the internet came along. Anyway, I eventually figured the book business out. I moved to Stillwater and started a book search service, and then started St. Croix Antiquarian Booksellers and the Stillwater Book Center. And these were so successful and caused so many other booksellers to move to town that Stillwater, that Richard Booth, the founder of the first book town in Wales, and the self-proclaimed king of Hay-on-Wye, came over in 1994 and declared Stillwater the first book town in North America. I'm sure you all remember that historic event. In the book, I talk about traveling to Hay-on-Wye and to Archer City, Texas, which was another book town started by Larry McMurtry, of course, the famous author of Lonesome Dove and The Last Picture Show. The Hay-on-Wye book town began in the late 60s when Richard Booth began buying up books that were being discarded by libraries in the UK, and then he began filling up abandoned buildings in his hometown of Hay-on-Wye, and eventually people started coming to buy the books, and other booksellers came and started stores, and the town became known as the town of books. And this was in the 70s. Booth was pretty eccentric, but he had a genius for publicity. As I say in the book, after a run-in with the Wales Tourist Board, this is an example of his ability to get people to pay attention to him. After a run-in with the Wales Tourist Board in 1977, Booth declared Hay an independent nation and appointed himself king. This generated enormous publicity. 6 television stations came to Hay to listen to him explain why the town was no longer part of the United Kingdom. The Hay Air Force, a biplane, made a fly past. A rowing boat was launched as the Hay Navy. And the sovereign retired to the pub to name his government. It was April Fool's Day, and the king was wearing a crown made out of tinfoil. The orb and scepter were made from the contents of a toilet. King Richard issued passports and printed money for the kingdom of Hay. He appointed a Hay House of Lords and installed his horse as the prime minister. Like Booth, the author, Larry McMurtry, bought up a bunch of abandoned buildings in his hometown of Archer City and filled them with 500,000 books. You can read about my travels to these 2 book towns in the book, but I think the point here is that they show how popular used and rare books were in the later 1990s, that they could support actual towns full of books. I also talk in the book about some of the direct and glancing contact I had with some of the more notorious book criminals of the era, including Stephen Bloomberg, who is a St. Paul native and was known as the Book Bandit. And he probably is the most prolific book thief in history. He was arrested in 1990 for stealing 23,600 books worth an estimated $20 million. He would come into the Arcade Street store on Saturdays, and this was my little hellhole on Arcade Street, and he would come in and he'd stand in the entryway and look around with his, he was obviously mentally ill, and he'd look around with his big googly eyes, and he wouldn't say anything. He'd just leave. And then one day I asked him, I said, "Well, can I help you find anything?" And he asked me if I had a rare book room. And I said, "Well, not only do I don't not have a rare book room, I don't even know if I have any rare books." And with that, he left and never came back. And when I found out later who he was, I was kind of mildly insulted that he didn't even bother looking around to see if I had anything worth stealing. John Jenkins was another very famous book thief and criminal. He was the so-called Texas bookmaker, and he was once president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association, which is probably as high up in the book-selling universe as you can get. But he became so enmeshed in gambling, forgeries, and loan sharking that he allegedly shot himself while standing in the middle of the Colorado River. And there's a lot of controversy as to whether he actually shot himself or was murdered. But there's a lot of colorful characters in the secondhand book business in particular, and part of the reason is that there sometimes is significant amounts of money involved, and there are very few regulations or people actually looking over other people's shoulders. So it seems to attract the less than ethical people. Anyway, through the story of my bookselling career, The Last Bookseller tries to put what happened to the secondhand book business because of the internet in some perspective. The transition from traveling booksellers and their personalized bookshops to the largely impersonal internet has probably been the most significant change in secondhand bookselling since the invention of the printing press. More important than the ups and downs of the book business, however, is the fundamental change that I believe has happened to the average person's attitude about towards books. And I think the simplest example of this is that before 2000, say, the people's attitude, even people who really didn't buy that many books or read that many books, when they would look at a shelf or a bookcase of books, they would think that, well, this is where I get the answers. This is where knowledge resides. And I think that has really shifted to the internet in these current, and of course not to the people here, but it really is a dramatic shift in people's attitudes about books. as I say in the book in conclusion, so the kind of bookseller I'm talking about here is a vanishing breed. Before the last dog dies, I wanted to describe what it was like to make a living in this curious and unconventional business. I traveled enough throughout the U.S., the United Kingdom, and Canada and saw enough to know my experiences reflect the changes that occurred in bookselling at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. These stories are told from my perspective, but are meant to give a realistic picture of this age-old occupation. The booksellers I describe here might not be the last ones, but they are likely the last of their kind. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Yeah. So you talk about, I've spent a lot of time, I collect books too, but I don't think I have anything that's valuable except to me. Um,
Yep.
but what makes one a rare and valuable book as opposed to just a secondhand book? Like,
Well, it's you know, it all has to do with price, right?
mhm.
So a book may be rare, but it might not necessarily be valuable. So and really, it's like anything else. If people want to pay for it, in the book I talk about the first Superman comic, where a little thin thing, where in 2012 or something it sold for $3.7 million, the first Superman comic. The first edition of The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, which was published 12 years earlier than that, sold for $50,000. And with the Dust Jacket, they're both about this. They're both about equally rare. I mean, the Hemingway is just as hard to find as the Superman, but more people wanted to buy and would pay the money for the Superman comic than the Hemingway. So it's all supply and demand, and it's all relative. It's all relative to what people will pay for it. The Game of Thrones book by, is it R.R. Martin or somebody like that?
Mhm.
Anyway, that sells for maybe $1,000, and that's largely on the strength of the television series, and that was published in maybe the late 1990s. Or here's another example. Before Trump became president, you could buy a signed copy of The Art of the Deal for $10. And then after he became president, I've seen him as high as $1,000. So it's all based on it's like anything else, it's based on supply and demand. If you look at a book published in the 1500s on some book of sermons by some obscure priest, it might be exceedingly rare. There might be 2 copies of it, but nobody wants it. Nobody wants. And so, the price of it really depends on the amount of interest that people have for it, for any book. It's very,
Yeah, it almost,
it's a,
oh,
it's
sorry, go
a,
ahead.
it's a very mercenary way of looking at it. And since I would publish or put out this book, I've been accused of being kind of bloodless as far as talking about some of these things, but it's really the truth that
Yeah.
uh, at a certain level, there's not a lot of romance in the pricing anyway, the market of the book, the
It
sentimental
seems a
value.
shame because, yeah.
What's that? Go ahead.
I was gonna say it seems a shame because there's a lot of really good books written that I have some, they're out of print now. I have some copies, but yeah, like you said, nobody wants them or pays money for them, but they're good. And you wonder how many good books were lost because nobody knew about them because they
Yeah,
didn't get the attention.
yeah, and I think that's true. But you have to separate when you're talking about books as objects, as artifacts, that's a different thing than when you're talking about books as a repository of ideas or a repository of sentiment. The two are really uh, two different things. If you um, I've got books back here that because of the edition and the condition and all that kind of thing, they have a certain amount of value, whereas one that was a second edition and not in as good condition would be worth much less or nothing. And so the two ideas are totally distinct. When you're talking about a rare book or an antiquarian book, you're talking about an artifact, an object. When you're talking about the virtues of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises or The Little Prince or anything that really is you're emotionally attached to, you're talking about an artistic achievement. So, and the two are really separate. So,
Yeah. Do you do you ever get into arguments over whether a book is a first edition? I know recently anyway, they put in their first edition like in the title
yeah,
page,
yeah.
but older books sometimes it's harder. I don't know that they always put first edition.
No, no, they didn't. It only started in, oh, I think the 20s is when they really started, some publishers. But there's actually a little pamphlet, a book that shows you how to determine whether or not something's a first edition. And most publishers now either use a number sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, or they actually say first edition. And that's not even, some publishers use both. So they have a number sequence and then they'll say first edition, but the number one will be missing, and that. So there's a lot of back and forth about whether or not, depending on the publisher. And over time, you do get into a discussion as to whether or not something's a first edition. Some books actually, if you have say early printings of some books like Steinbeck or Hemingway or those people, the way you tell a true first might be by a printing error, or that they stopped the printing of the first book on the presses and made a change, and then continued to print the book. But well, the true first is the one that was printed before they made that change. It's really kind of a nutsy um, field in some respects. For collectors especially, they get really obsessive about those states and all that kind of thing.
Is it hard to let go of a book that you know you'll never see again because it's so rare?
It is, it has been, but like I say in my book and talk about it, I had 6 children, so I was, I think, a little bit more I was a little bit more mercenary than some because I had to support them. But yeah, there's a lot of books I would love to have back in my, that I've had in my career. So.
You read them at all, or when you any of them before you sell them, or you just don't want
Well,
to do any damage?
it depends on what I'm interested in. Again, it's that sometimes booksellers can't make that distinction between the the product that you're selling and the emotional attachment. There's a book called the Memoirs of a Bankrupt Bookseller, and he was he was a guy who had a lot of book. He bought a bookstore and he had a lot of books, and he had a real hard time selling them because he became emotionally attached to all of them, and eventually he committed suicide because his business was so bad. But and that's true of a lot of booksellers who get into the business and they cannot make the distinction between I'm one book that the book that I'm buying and selling is not a book that I'm emotionally attached to. They really do get emotionally attached to them. So as to the question as to whether I read the books or not, it would depend on if I was interested in it. You know, that would be the criteria. If I was interested, I might read it. But if I handled a lot of books I had no interest in reading. You know, that was
Yeah.
that was my thing that I would buy them to sell them, and that was it.
Do a lot of the collectors, do you think, buy them to read them, or they buy them just to own them and have them?
I think it depends on the collector and what their collectors generally have a purpose. They have something that they want to accomplish when they're putting together a collection. And so if somebody gets fixated on a particular author and they want to collect everything that the author wrote, um, they're collecting the kind of the entire work. They may not want to read everything, but what they are putting together as a whole has some meaning to them, is important to them. So
Have you gotten into any bidding wars with other booksellers at estate sales or elsewhere or online trying to
well,
get your hands on a book?
mostly it had that would have to do with big collections. I would have if I was trying to buy a collection of 10,000 books. That's mostly with me. That's mostly when that would come up. So the person would call in 5 booksellers and say, "How much will you give me for these?" And they would, and then the booksellers would say what they would pay for the collection, and then the highest bid would win it. But as far as individual books, I never did much with auctions because um, I didn't really trust myself. I usually wound up spending way more than I should have at auctions, so I didn't do much with them.
Did you ever find something incredibly rare and valuable at somewhere like a Goodwill or somebody's garage sale for like 50 cents or something and it was like worth a lot?
Yeah, yeah. I actually talk about this in my book. I had a deal going with Goodwill Industries of St. Paul and Minneapolis where I would help them price the books that they received in donations, and then they would let me pick out whatever I found for like $1 a book. And I found some tremendous. It was a nasty job and really really hard work. So I think I eventually earned every dollar I made that way, but but I found, like I say in the book, I found a signed a book signed by John F. Kennedy, and I found a first edition Edgar Rice Burroughs, like his first book, books that would be worth thousands of dollars today. That's another thing that's, um, I talk in the book about going to England and buying a set of the Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and these were first editions in dust jackets. And I remember I paid maybe £800 for them, maybe $1,200, and I can't remember maybe it was £400. I paid £400 for them, and I sold them for $1,200 when I came back. Well, that set now would be worth maybe $40,000. That Lord of the Rings set. So, see, you can't keep everything,
Yeah.
and
That's what they tell me, but I don't believe them.
yeah, that's right.
What, how did
Yeah.
you deal,
I'm
What's that?
sorry. Go ahead, Gillette.
just as another former used bookseller, how did you deal with when people would come in your front door with their boxes of books, that then, they wanted to, you know, offload on you and take out some, like everybody always thinks their books are worth way more than they actually are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wouldn't. I just wouldn't buy them. I would have people come in and say, "Well, I'll give you these books," and I wouldn't take them. I just refuse to. I refuse to. You're probably a nicer person than I am, Gillette. I I just wouldn't do it. I just know. And again in the book I talk about how it's a real mistake for booksellers to take books that are sort of, because there's a lot of books that are just dead weight. Let's face it.
Yep.
When you have that many, if you consider, like again, I say that 335 billion books have been printed, there's a lot of bad books out there. I mean, bad in the sense that there's no market for them, or, well, and also bad because because they're bad. But um, there just is. So a bookseller you can drown in that stuff. You really can if you're not careful. Tony, what?
I have two experiences to relate. The first is that a man about 6 years older, 5 years older than I am, became a Hemingway scholar.
Oh yeah,
And for some reason, I've always loved Hemingway. And at one point, I tried to collect everything that he had written.
oh
And
there you go.
I contacted this man, and he said just what you have said now, that it was very difficult back in those days to do a search and find some of the earlier writings.
Yes.
So, and the second point I wanted to make is that I did have some Hemingway, and in the end, I just sort of gave away a lot of books when I made a transition. But the second thing is that some people are installing little free libraries.
Yep.
Had experience with those. And yes, there are some good books shared in that system, but most of them are dead weight.
Yep.
When I monitored two little free libraries, I would get pretty well-worn romance novels, old Bibles,
Yeah.
a lot of religious material that people were wanting to promote.
Yeah.
So yes, as you said, there's a lot of dead weight being shared.
Well, people have, like I say, there people have had in the past, and I still think that a lot of people do, have a kind of a reverence for books. And a lot of people just cannot stand the idea of throwing away a book. And so they'll put them there, they give them to Goodwill, they but they just cannot stand the idea of throwing away a book. And I think that's, part of the reason why they wind up, they follow people around like a bad penny, that.
And I'm sorry I disposed of them.
Yeah. Well, the Hemingway it's very tricky to get real to figure out what's valuable and what's not valuable in the modern first edition field. That's for sure.
What about all the uh, the people that were promoting reading? There was Oprah's book club and several other personalities that would have a book of the month, and some still do. There still is Book of the Month Club.
Yep.
And a lot of people, someone I know collected every book that Oprah presented on her program.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think that she's not on TV, but that you have to go on a site to find out what she's offering every month.
Yeah. That's kind of out of my.
Well,
That's
it's just
kind of out of my depth, Tony. I don't.
well, it's just
again.
I think it's good I think the point I wanted to make is that people are still interested, and they like to follow those sites to see what's currently being offered for their
Yeah.
own perusal and their own writing.
Yeah. Oh, I think people.
That's
I think people. Yeah, I think people still read and still are very interested in books and I guess that's not my premise. I'm talking about
I
specifically.
realize that.
Yeah, I'm talking specifically about um, the state of the used and rare book business.
Right.
But also, I'm talking about how hard it is for booksellers to actually kind of make a living in this day and age because they're competing with so many different, Amazon and e-books and all that kind of thing. So the competition is a lot harder than when I was um, selling books.
When one of the bookseller conferences that I went to a few years ago, they were saying that really avid readers that are all about supporting brick and mortar bookstores still only spend 4 out of every $10 of their book purchases in an actual physical bookstore.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
I always just said, I just am glad that I'm getting a piece of your pie.
right. Yeah, it's I have a kind of an extensive discussion about that in my book, and that is that you hear a lot about these bookstores that they're kind of going out of business and they start these GoFundMe pages and these things like that, or they have the community come and try to help them survive. But I don't think a store can survive unless it's really gonna survive on its own and not be subsidized by different means. And that's tough. You really gotta hustle to make it in the book business.
And it's a shame. One of my favorite things to do is wander through bookstores.
Yeah,
And there's so much fewer of them now. And I
right.
like the used ones because you never know what you were going to find. And
Yeah,
you might come across something you'd never even heard of that just caught your eye.
right.
Or, and there was a culture and you could run into other people who, although I
A
tend to
seedy
run into
culture.
weirdos.
Yeah, seedy
But
weirdo
generally,
culture.
yeah,
Yeah,
but at least they read.
yeah, that's right. No, it is. It's really it really is the passing of an age in a lot of ways. And I've gotten kind of a lot of flack from other booksellers, and yet they agree with me that it's the way that things were uh, the way that things were done before 2000, like I say, and after 2000 are just totally different worlds, as far as that goes.
Yeah. Although online books, I've tried ebooks, but to me, they're just harder to read. I like having the physical book in my hands
Yeah,
and the turning the page and reading. And it's not as bad on your eyes. The screen, after a while, you're like, ugh, enough.
right, right, right.
And it seems like it's another part of community that's sort of disappearing because people would go to their local bookstore and it was a
Yeah,
place to exchange information and ideas and
yeah,
make
yeah.
connections.
It really is a, like I say, it's a, and I can't make too much of the nostalgia part of it, but it really is a changed perspective as far as books are concerned. That's for sure.
Gary, do you know Freya Manfred, who lives near Stillwater? An
I
author.
don't know her. Is that Frederick's daughter?
I don't know, Gillette, can you answer that question?
No, I cannot.
She was,
Lina might be able
she
to.
was
Yeah, I think it is.
Frederick's daughter.
I think that's Frederick's daughter. Yeah.
Yes.
But
She,
I don't know. I don't know her
she
personally.
was she did an author event in Wadena for BookEnds
Oh,
in the early years.
oh, okay.
And I think she's
Yeah.
coming again, isn't she?
Yeah, there's Frederick.
Yep. That's
Oh,
her. That's
that's
her dad.
her. Yeah.
Yep.
So I got that right.
All
So
right.
um, what, Gillette?
Go ahead, Shelley.
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
I was just
I was just curious. I think she's coming again for BookEnds, maybe in late August, early September. But I have a high school classmate that is familiar with her work. He and his wife live in Stillwater. I was just making a connection. Thank you.
all right. Did anybody have any other questions? Well, goodbye, everybody at home watching later.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Gary Goodman, for joining us and sharing your stories. They're very interesting.
good. And well, thanks for having me. It was great.